March 3, 1943. North Atlantic, 150 miles southwest of Iceland. The night was black and endless. Waves the size of houses slammed into the steel hull of the Royal Air Force's B-24 Liberator as it clawed through a gale. Rain pounded against the cockpit glass like handfuls of gravel. Inside, every man on board was soaked to the bone, eyes fixed on the dim green glow of a radar screen that hummed softly in the dark. At 2:47 a.m., a flicker appeared. Just a ghostly pulse of light, then gone. The operator leaned closer, his hands trembling. Contact, bearing 187, range 6 miles. The pilot, Flight Lieutenant Henry Morris, snapped his head toward him. "Confirm that, Jenkins." "Confirmed, sir. Something's out there." Morris didn't hesitate. He banked the Liberator into a slow turn, the 4 engines groaning under the strain. The men could see nothing outside but rain and darkness. Below them lay the killing ground, a stretch of ocean where Allied convoys vanished without a trace. Somewhere beneath those waves lurked the reason why: the German U-boats. For years they'd been the hunters, but tonight the hunter was about to be hunted. The radar blip strengthened, steady, rhythmic, unmistakable. "It's moving, sir. Surfaced by the look of it." Jenkins wiped condensation from the scope with his sleeve, watching the green trace painted story again and again. Each sweep revealed the target more clearly. He'd been trained on this equipment for only 3 weeks. The ASV Mark III was so new that most of Coastal Command still didn't have it. The instructors had called it a miracle. Jenkins called it witchcraft. Behind him, the navigator, Sergeant Bill Crawford, hunched over his charts with a red-filtered torch, plotting their approach vector. "If we come in from the northwest, we'll have the wind behind us. Faster approach, harder for them to hear us." "Good thinking," Morris replied. His hands were steady on the controls, but his heart hammered in his chest. In 18 months of flying patrols over the Atlantic, he'd seen U-boats exactly 3 times, always in daylight, always diving before he could get within attack range. At night, they were ghosts, invisible, untouchable. Until now. The crew loaded flares, depth charges, and machine guns. The Liberator sliced through the night, guided not by eyes, but by invisible waves bouncing off the ocean. A technology once dismissed as fantasy, now their lifeline. 3 miles, Jenkins called out. "Still on the surface, speed 8 knots. Morris throttled back slightly, reducing engine noise. The U-boat crew wouldn't hear them over their own diesels. Not yet. But timing was everything. Too early, and they'd dive. Too late, and the flak guns would tear them apart. "Load the lee light," Morris ordered. The bomb aimer, Flying Officer Thomas Reed, flipped switches on the control panel. Beneath the aircraft's belly, a massive searchlight, capable of producing 70 million candle power, hummed to life, warming up, but still dark. 2 miles. The Liberator descended to 200 feet, skimming just above the wavetops. Wind buffeted the aircraft. Rain streamed across the windscreen. Morris flew by instruments alone, trusting the radar to guide them to a target he couldn't see. 1 mile, dead ahead. "Stand by light," Morris said, his voice calm despite the adrenaline flooding his system. Then, through the rain, he gave the order. "Now!" The first flare burst open, bright magnesium fire tearing the darkness apart. And there it was. A long, gray shadow slicing through the waves, the black cross of the Kriegsmarine gleaming under the flare's light. U-boat. The gunner yelled, "Target in sight!" Morris dropped altitude, engines roaring as the plane dove.
The U-boat crew scrambled on deck, shouting, aiming their 20mm flak guns skyward, but too late. Reed hit the switch. The lee light blazed to life, a column of white brilliance that turned night into day, pinning the submarine like an insect under glass. The U-boat's conning tower stood out in stark detail, the spray of water around its bow, the panicked figures on deck, even the individual rivets in her hull. "Bombs away!" Reed shouted. Depth charges tumbled from the belly of the Liberator, splashing into the sea in a perfect line ahead of the diving submarine. Morris yanked the control column back, climbing hard. The plane shook violently. Then the ocean erupted behind them, geysers of fire and foam rising into the storm. The shockwave hit the Liberator like a giant's fist, throwing it sideways. Morris fought the controls, bringing the aircraft level. Banking around, he circled back toward the attack site. The U-boat lifted from the water, its back broken, bow pointing toward the sky. For a moment it hung there, suspended between sea and air. Then it slipped beneath the waves, trailing oil and debris. Silence followed. Then a cheer from the crew, raw, disbelieving joy. They had done what months ago seemed impossible. They had found and destroyed a U-boat in the dark of night. Crawford marked the position on his chart with a red X. Jenkins stared at his radar screen, still watching the ghost echo fade. Reed, in the bomb-aimer's position, pressed his forehead against the cold perspex and closed his eyes. "That's one less," Morris said quietly, turning the Liberator toward home. But the real story didn't begin here, over the Black Atlantic. It began in a small, cluttered laboratory in Britain, years before a single Allied bomber had radar on board. It began with one man who dared to prove that the invisible could be seen. February 26, 1935, Daventry, England. Inside a drafty wooden hut on the edge of a field, a man in a tweed suit stared at an oscilloscope the size of a dinner plate. His name was Robert Watson Watt, a Scottish physicist, sharp-eyed and restless, with the manner of someone always thinking 2 steps ahead. He was 43 years old, balding, with a salt-and-pepper mustache and eyes that missed nothing. His colleagues at the radio research station called him brilliant but difficult, a man who could solve problems no one else could see, but who has little patience for bureaucracy or doubt. Outside, the sky rumbled. A Hayford bomber, one of the RAF's lumbering biplanes, circled above the field, its engines droning like a giant bee. Watson Watt leaned over the equipment, voice calm but precise. "Now, transmit." His assistant, Arnold Wilkins, flipped a switch. The machine crackled, sending out invisible pulses of radio energy into the air, shortwave broadcasts at 49-meter wavelength, transmitted from the nearby BBC station at Daventry. Seconds later, faint spikes appeared on the screen, ripples of electricity dancing across green light. "There," Watson Watt said quietly, pointing with the stem of his pipe. "Do you see them? That's them." The airplanes, visible only as radio echoes, had reflected the signal back to their receiver. For the first time in history, humans had seen aircraft through the air itself. Wilkins stared at the screen, his breath caught in his throat. He'd spent the last 3 months helping Watson Watt build this apparatus from spare parts and borrowed equipment. They'd been mocked by other researchers, called dreamers, told that radio detection of aircraft was theoretically impossible. Yet here it was, the impossible, glowing green on a cathode screen. What Watson Watt had just demonstrated was revolutionary. But to the Air Ministry officials watching behind him, men in uniform with ribbons from the Great War, it looked like science fiction. One of them, Wing Commander Edward Fennessy, shifted uncomfortably. You're telling me we can detect enemy bombers with a glorified wireless set? Watson Watt turned, his expression unreadable. He'd dealt with skeptics his entire career, men who couldn't see past what already existed to imagine what might be possible. "Gentlemen," he replied, carefully relighting his pipe, "I'm telling you we can make the sky itself warn us when they come. We can see aircraft at ranges far beyond human vision. We can track their speed, their altitude, their bearing, and we can do it in darkness, in fog, in any weather conditions you care to name." He gestured to the oscilloscope. "This is crude, a proof of concept only. But give me funding, give me time, and I will build you a chain of stations that can detect every aircraft approaching Britain from 100 miles away."
The officials exchanged glances. Britain's air defenses in 1935 were pitiful. A handful of obsolete fighters, a few searchlight batteries, acoustic listening devices that barely worked. If another war came, German bombers would reach London before anyone knew they'd taken off. "How much time?" Fennessy asked. 2 years, perhaps 3. "And how much money?" Watson Watt smiled thinly. "Less than a single battleship, more than a fleet of motor cars. But I can promise you this, gentlemen, it will be the best investment His Majesty's government ever makes." They didn't fully believe him, not yet, but Britain would soon have no choice. Just a few years later, everything changed. Hitler remilitarized the Rhineland. Mussolini invaded Ethiopia. The Spanish Civil War became a testing ground for new weapons. And in Britain, politicians who had spent 2 decades avoiding war suddenly realized it was coming whether they liked it or not. Watson Watt got his funding. By 1936, the first experimental radar station rose on the coast at Bawdsey Manor in Suffolk, a Victorian mansion converted into a laboratory. Tall steel towers pierced the sky, strung with antenna arrays that looked like giant radio masts. Locals called them Watson Watt's folly. The technology was primitive, the equipment temperamental. On humid days, the cathode screens fogged over. On cold nights, the vacuum tubes failed. Operators had to be trained to interpret the fuzzy green blips, distinguishing between aircraft and atmospheric interference. But it worked. By 1938, as Hitler marched into Austria and then Czechoslovakia, a chain of radar stations stretched along Britain's eastern and southern coasts. 20 stations, each capable of detecting aircraft at ranges up to 120 miles. They called it Chain Home, and it would save the nation. Watson Watt drove himself relentlessly, working 18-hour days, traveling between stations, solving technical problems, training operators. His marriage suffered, his health declined, but he never wavered. He understood what was at stake. In the next war, cities would burn, thousands would die from the air, and Britain's only hope was to see the bombers coming in time to scramble fighters to intercept them. On September 3, 1939, Britain declared war on Germany. The very next day, Chain Home detected its first hostile aircraft, a formation of German bombers heading toward the Royal Navy base at Scapa Flow. RAF fighters scrambled. The bombers were intercepted. Some were shot down. Others fled. And in his office at Bawdsey, Watson Watt allowed himself a moment of satisfaction. It was working. His invisible eyes were watching. The true test came in the summer of 1940. France had fallen. The British Army had been evacuated from Dunkirk. Britain stood alone against Nazi Germany. Hitler ordered Operation Sea Lion, the invasion of Britain. But first, the Luftwaffe had to destroy the Royal Air Force. Beginning in July,
German bombers and fighters swept across the channel in massive waves, hundreds of aircraft at a time, attacking airfields, radar stations, factories, and cities. If the Luftwaffe deigned air superiority, the invasion would follow. The RAF had fewer than 700 fighters. The Luftwaffe had over 2,600 aircraft. On paper, it was no contest. But the RAF had something the Germans didn't: radar. Every morning, operators at chain home stations watched their screens, tracking the German formations assembling over France. They reported the sightings to Fighter Command headquarters at Bentley Priory, where controllers plotted the raids on massive maps and scrambled fighters to intercept. It meant that RAF pilots didn't have to fly constant patrols, burning fuel and exhausting themselves. They could wait on the ground, engines warm, until radar detected incoming raids. Then they could scramble, climb to altitude, and meet the Germans head-on. Air Chief Marshal Hugh Dowding, commander of Fighter Command, called radar the vital factor in Britain's survival. Without it, he said later, we should have lost the Battle of Britain. The Germans never understood why RAF fighters always seemed to know exactly where they were. They suspected spies, assumed the British had broken their codes, and eventually began to believe the RAF had far more aircraft than it actually did. In reality, it was simpler. Watson Watt had given Britain the power to see through the sky. By October 1940, Hitler postponed Operation Sea Lion indefinitely. The Luftwaffe had lost too many aircraft. The RAF, against all odds, had won. But Watson Watt was restless still. Radar had proven itself in the air. But what about at sea? The Atlantic had become the Allies' bleeding wound. German U-boats prowled the shipping lanes, sinking convoys faster than the Royal Navy could replace them. Thousands of sailors went to watery graves, often without ever seeing their killers. Every day, Winston Churchill received reports of more lost ships and more supplies that would never reach Britain's shores. He would later admit, the only thing that really frightened me during the war was the U-boat peril. And so the call went out again, not to a general, not to a sailor, but to a physicist. If radar could find aircraft in the sky, could it also find submarines in the dark? Watson Watt thought it could, and once again he set out to make the impossible visible. September 1940, Bay of Biscay. Captain Lieutenant Otto Kremschner stood on the conning tower of U-99, scanning the horizon through salt-crusted binoculars. The sea stretched empty in every direction, just rolling gray waves beneath an overcast sky. Perfect hunting weather. Kremschner was 28 years old and already a legend among U-boat crews. They called him Silent Otto, because he preferred stealth to aggression, stalking convoys for hours, firing from point-blank range, and then vanishing before escorts could react. He'd already sunk over 200,000 tons of Allied shipping. "Contact," his watch officer called. "Smoke on the horizon bearing 270. Kremschner smiled. Another convoy, another kill. He dove the U-boat to periscope depth and crept closer. Through the lens, he counted 12 merchant ships, fat, slow freighters loaded with food, fuel, and ammunition, bound for Britain. Only 3 escorts, corvettes probably, small and undermanned. Easy prey. That night, after sunset, Kremschner surfaced. The diesels rumbled to life, recharging batteries and pushing the U-boat through the water at 17 knots. He closed to within 600 meters of the convoy's flank, invisible in the darkness. Then he fired, torpedo after torpedo, each one finding its mark. Ships exploded, burned, sank. The escorts raced around frantically, dropping depth charges at random, but Kremschner was already gone, slipping away into the night. By dawn, 5 merchant ships were at the bottom of the Atlantic. Kremschner marked the kills in his log and radioed headquarters. Enemy convoy destroyed, no casualties, returning to base. For the German Navy, it was just another successful patrol. For the Allies, it was a disaster that was becoming routine. In 1940 alone, U-boats sank over 1,000 Allied ships, 3.7 million tons of supplies lost. Britain was slowly starving. If the hemorrhaging continued, the war would be lost not on battlefields, but in the cold depths of the Atlantic. Summer 1941, Malvern Hills, England. The war had consumed Europe. The Channel convoys ran under blackout, hunted night after night, and in an old school building converted into a secret laboratory, Robert Watson Watt and his team were racing against death itself. The corridors of the telecommunications research establishment buzzed with activity. Engineers in rolled-up sleeves huddled over vacuum tubes, copper coils, and cathode screens. The smell of ozone filled the air, the scent of hot metal and invention. Watson Watt stood at the center of it all, pipe clamped between his teeth, scribbling equations across a blackboard smeared with chalk dust. "We need higher frequencies," he said, tapping the board with a piece of chalk. "Shorter wavelengths. The chain-home system operates at 10 meters, far too long to reflect off a U-boat's conning tower. The beam must be fine enough to catch a speck in the sea." Arnold Wilkins frowned, studying the calculations. "At those wavelengths, sir, the circuits will melt. The power requirements are too high. We'd need transmitters capable of generating kilowatts at centimetric wavelengths. That's beyond anything we've built." Watson Watt exhaled through his nose, the pipe glowing faintly. "Then we find a way." The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. 2 British physicists, John Randall and Harry Boot, working at Birmingham University. In early 1940, they invented the cavity magnetron, a small device, no larger than a man's fist, capable of generating powerful microwave radiation. It was revolutionary. With the magnetron, radar could operate at 10-centimeter wavelengths, short enough to detect small objects with extraordinary precision. When Watson Watt first saw the device, he held it in his palm and smiled. "Gentlemen," he said to his team, "this changes everything." Weeks turned into months. Prototype after prototype failed. Some melted their transmitters. Others sent out signals so weak they couldn't detect a destroyer at a mile. The magnetron's power had to be carefully controlled. Too much, and it burned out. Too little, and the returns were useless. But they persisted, testing, rewiring, retrying. The new radar system was called ASV Mark III, Air-to-Surface Vessel Mark III. It consisted of a transmitter, using the cavity magnetron, a rotating antenna beneath the aircraft's fuselage, and a display screen in the operator's position. The antenna rotated continuously, scanning the sea in all directions. When the radar pulse struck a U-boat's conning tower or periscope, it reflected back. The screen painted the return as a bright blip, showing range and bearing. In November 1941, the first test flights began over the Irish Sea. Squadron leader Humphrey de Verde Lee flew the prototype, with an operator hunched over the new radar screen. They flew low, scanning the empty ocean, waiting. Then the operator's voice. "Contact. Range 4 miles, bearing 290. Lee adjusted course. His navigator called out ranges as they closed. At 2 miles, visibility was still 0, just clouds and waves. At 1 mile, the operator said, "Target should be visible now." Lee descended through the cloud layer, and there it was, a Royal Navy submarine running a practice exercise exactly where the radar had said it would be. The crew erupted in cheers. It worked. It actually worked. Watson Watt received the report while meeting with Admiral Percy Noble, Commander-in-Chief of Western Approaches. He slid the telegram across the desk with quiet satisfaction. "Admiral," he said to his team, "we can now see U-boats in total darkness, from the air, at ranges far beyond visual contact. The Atlantic is about to become a very dangerous place for submarines." Noble read the report twice and then looked up. "How soon can we deploy this?" "Production begins immediately. Every coastal command aircraft will be equipped within 6 months. But there was one more innovation needed, something to complement the radar's electronic eyes.
Radar could detect U-boats, but detection wasn't enough. By the time an aircraft closed to visual range, the U-boat would have dived, vanishing beneath the waves where depth charges were far less effective. What was needed was a way to illuminate the target instantly, turning night into day before the submarine could react. Squadron leader Humphrey de Verde Lee, the same pilot who'd tested ASV Mark III, proposed a solution: mount a powerful searchlight beneath the aircraft. When radar detected a U-boat, the plane would approach in darkness, then switch on the light at the last moment, blinding the crew and allowing an immediate attack. The Air Ministry was skeptical. "A searchlight? That's your brilliant innovation?" Lee was undeterred. "Not just any searchlight, sir. A 24-inch carbon arc lamp producing 70 million candle power. Bright enough to read a newspaper at a mile. Bright enough to freeze a U-boat crew in place while we drop our charges. And won't it also illuminate our aircraft, making us a target for flak? For about 15 seconds, yes, but by then we'll have already attacked." It took months to convince the brass, but eventually Lee got approval. By mid-1942, the Lee Light was in production, a retractable searchlight mounted in a ventral turret, operated by the bomb aimer, synchronized with the radar. The combination was devastating. Radar for detection, the Lee Light for the kill. U-boat crews never saw it coming. June 4, 1942, Bay of Biscay. U-502 was running on the surface, diesels roaring, recharging batteries after a day submerged. The night was dark, the sea calm. Captain Lieutenant Jürgen von Rosenstiel stood on the conning tower, smoking a cigarette, confident in the darkness. 20 miles away, an RAF Wellington bomber equipped with ASV Mark III and a Lee Light was hunting. "Contact," the radar operator reported. "Range 12 miles. The pilot, Flying Officer Wiley B. Howell, turned toward the blip. He throttled back, approaching slowly, silently. At 3 miles, he descended to 250 feet. At 1 mile, he armed the depth charges. At 600 yards, he flipped the switch. The Lee Light blazed, brilliant white fire cutting through the night. The U-boat crew froze, shielding their eyes, completely blind. "Alarm!" Captain Lieutenant von Rosenstiel screamed. "Dive! Dive!" But it was too late. Depth charges fell in a perfect line. The explosions lifted U-502 halfway out of the water. Its hull split open. Within seconds, it was gone. There were no survivors. Captain Lieutenant Herbert Neckel lay in his bunk, unable to sleep. His U-boat, U-531, was 3 weeks into its patrol and they hadn't sunk a single ship. Worse, they'd barely seen any. The convoys had changed their routes. The escorts were more aggressive. And at night, when U-boats used to reign supreme, something new was hunting them. 3 boats from his wolf pack had vanished in the last week. No distress calls, no survivors, just gone. Neckel's radio operator brought him the latest message from BDU, U-boat headquarters. "Sir, Admiral Dönitz is recalling all boats from the North Atlantic effective immediately." Neckel sat up. "What?" "All boats, sir.
were ordered to return to base. It was unprecedented. For 3 years, the U-boats had dominated the Atlantic. Now they were retreating. Neckel read the message himself, his hands trembling slightly. Between the lines, he could read the truth. They were losing, badly. In May 1943 alone, the Germans lost 41 submarines. The Allies called it Black May. Admiral Dönitz called it beyond endurance. The tide had turned. At Western Approaches Command in Liverpool, Admiral Max Horton studied the casualty reports with grim satisfaction. The graph on his wall showed a dramatic reversal. Convoy losses plummeting, U-boat losses soaring. "Gentlemen," he said to his staff, "we are witnessing the end of the U-boat as an effective weapon. Radar has broken them." And it was true. Between radar-equipped aircraft, improved convoy tactics, more escorts, and better intelligence from ultra-decrypts, the U-boats had lost their advantage. By late 1943, it was safer to serve on a convoy escort than in a U-boat. German submariners had a 75% casualty rate, the highest of any branch of any military in the war. Admiral Dönitz wrote later, "The enemy's technical superiority has utterly defeated us. Our losses are catastrophic." And behind that superiority stood men like Robert Watson Watt, quiet, stubborn, driven by curiosity more than glory. When asked years later if he considered himself a hero, Watson Watt laughed softly. A hero? No. Merely a man who refused to be told something couldn't be done. He was knighted in 1942, becoming Sir Robert Watson Watt. But he remained a scientist at heart, uncomfortable with fame, more interested in the next problem than in celebrating past successes. After the war, radar technology exploded. It found applications in aviation, weather forecasting, astronomy, and medicine. The cavity magnetron became the heart of microwave ovens. The oscilloscope became standard laboratory equipment. Watson Watt lived to see radar become so commonplace that people forgot it had once been revolutionary. He died in 1973 at age 81. Largely forgotten by the public. But to those who understood what he'd accomplished, he was a giant, a man who had literally changed the world. The men who flew. Flight Lieutenant Henry Morris survived the war, flying 89 missions over the Atlantic. He rarely spoke of what he'd seen: the U-boats destroyed, the men who drowned, the nights of terror and triumph. After the war, he became a commercial pilot, flying passengers across the same ocean he once hunted submarines over. Sometimes on night flights, he'd look down at the black water and remember the green glow of the radar screen. His children asked him once what he did in the war. He smiled and said, "I helped keep the lights on in Britain." It was enough. Over 30,000 Allied merchant seamen died in the Battle of the Atlantic. Over 30,000 German submariners died, 3/4 of all who served. The ocean became a graveyard, holding secrets that would never surface. Radar didn't end the war, but it turned the tide, giving the Allies a technological edge that the Germans could never overcome. From that moment on, every plane that soared through the stormy Atlantic carried more than bombs. It carried the power of sight itself, the eyes that could pierce the night, the technology that changed war forever. The age of radar had begun, and with it, the age where darkness could no longer hide the enemy, where the invisible became visible, where human ingenuity triumphed over the chaos of war. The Battle of the Atlantic was won not by the biggest guns or the fastest ships, but by the quiet genius of a Scottish physicist who dared to see what others couldn't.